All right, so programming note, I think I'm caught up on all emailed questions. We've gotten some good feedback, so please keep doing that if you're participating online. And obviously, if you're here, you can ask questions here. All right, last session, we finished up Joseph Smith's theology in a comparison to classical theism. We looked at the differences between those two from the starting point. Obviously, they started from a Greek metaphysical position and then reasoned their way to God's attributes. Joseph Smith starts with a position of trust, a relationship of trust that he calls faith between humans and God, and that's his starting point for his theology, as the lectures on faith show. We went through some of the classical theistic positions like necessity, timelessness, the differences there, immutable impassibility, simplicity. We talked about the difference in omnipotence, especially when you take into account Joseph's idea of self-existent persons and pre-existent matter, how that dealt with, how that flowed through to creation, ex nihilo for classical theists, and ex materia, or from pre-existing matter for Joseph. Finally, what does that all mean for relationship to humans and potential human potential? There's an ontological gulf, a difference of being, a fundamental being between God and humans in classical theism, versus God and humans being both self-existent and capable of enlargement for Joseph. We then found that we looked at, we applied Joseph's theology to a number of questions in classical theism and in human existence. So the question of nihilism, the threat of non-being. We talked about how Joseph Smith's theology dissolves that question entirely. Persons cannot cease to exist. Talked about the paradoxes of creation in classical theism. How can a God outside of time that's immaterial create time and enter into time? Talked about how his theology of material, spirit, and body requiring each other for full selfhood, resolving the classic mind-body problem. Finally, we looked in particular at the issue of divine embodiment, the idea that God has a body, and we showed through early Christian texts that this was the original position of Christians, right? Up until the 5th century AD is when we have the riots in Egypt that we talked about when the edict came down that you have to believe in an immaterial God, and the monks in Egypt are very angry about this. So up until this time, belief in embodied God was the Christian Orthodox position. So we concluded that Joseph's embodied God actually restores that original Christian understanding of God having a body. We're going to continue now looking at a number of different topics in particular. So we're going to start with God as personal and passable. So oftentimes if we're talking with classical theists, they might say or say that, yeah, I believe God is a person like you do. What we have to understand is that we may be talking past one another in this respect. So, for example, the Catholic Encyclopedia says this: when we say that God is a personal being, we mean that he is intelligent and free and distinct from the created universe. Personality as such expresses perfection, and if human personality as such connotes imperfection, it must be remembered that, as in the case of similar predicates, this connotation is excluded when we attribute personality to God. It is principally by way of opposition to pantheism that divine personality is emphasized by the theistic philosopher. Right? They're thinking of person in a different way. It is principally by way of opposition to the idea that God is everything, pantheism. God is the world, that they even use the term personality or person, right? The problem is, as stated by a scholar or a theologian, T.E. Pollard, he says that ascribing to God the characteristics of immutability and impassibility, quote, ends inevitably in the use of terms which are not superpersonal but subpersonal. Right? When we start talking about God, as some have described the classic theistic position as a cosmic unblinking stare, immutable. You cannot be changed in any way. Impassible. You can't feel anything. All right? Aseity. There's nothing that can affect you from the outside. We end up talking in a subpersonal way, not something that is more than personhood, but actually less than personhood. And this is a problem of the classic theistic position. This is an evangelical scholar, John Sanders. He says, quote, "A person is not primarily an isolated cogito, an isolated mind, right? But an agent who acts, wills, plans, loves, creates, and values in relation to other persons." He's writing against the classical theistic position of God. And he's arguing that you're not ascribing to, you say he's a person, but you're not meaning what we mean what most people mean when they talk about a person. Charles Hartshorne stated the problem in this manner. What it comes to is that in retreating from popular anthropomorphism, right, God as man, so embodiment, personhood, classical theology fell backward into an opposite error. Intent on not exaggerating the likeness of the divine and the human, they did away with it altogether. If one takes their statements literally, using the word love, they emptied it of its most essential kernel, the element of sympathy, of the feeling of others' feelings. It became mere beneficence, totally unmoved, to use their own word, by the sufferings or joys of the creatures. Who wants a friend who loves only in that sense? Right? 1984, right? So, as we're going to talk about, this idea, this classical theistic position that is held for centuries starts to come under attack by its own proponents for these reasons. I'm not quoting any Mormon theologians right now, right? Thomas Winandy is perhaps one of the only modern-day proponents of classical impassibility. He wrote, "Does God Suffer?" But he even states our thesis for us. From the dawn of the patristic period, Christian theology is held as axiomatic that God is impassible. That is, he does not undergo emotional changes of state and so cannot suffer. Toward the end of the 19th century, a sea change began to occur within Christian theology. Right? Toward the end of the 19th century. So late 1800s, we start to get a sea change presaged by people that are making these type of arguments against the classical understanding. In 1959, Daniel Day Williams described the growing belief that God suffers as a, quote, structural shift in the Christian mind. Jürgen Moltmann, we get it from the classic tradition. Christian theology acquired Greek philosophy's ways of thinking in the Hellenistic world. And since that time, most theologians have simultaneously maintained the passion of Christ, God's Son, and the deity's essential incapacity for suffering, even though it was at the price of having to talk paradoxically about, quote, the sufferings of the God who cannot suffer. But in doing this, they have simply added together Greek philosophy's apathy axiom and the central statement of the gospel. The contradiction remains and remains unsatisfactory. Right? So the classical tradition, for a while, they just would talk, in what I would call nonsense or paradoxes. But within their own tradition, they're understanding that this is not satisfactory. Fast forward to 1986, we get Ronald Getz calling the rise of a new orthodoxy in the Christian century that called the suffering God. No one of whom I'm aware has quite said that the rejection of the ancient doctrine of divine impassibility has become a theological commonplace. Yet when one ventures to make this claim in the presence of theologians, one is invariably met with a slightly surprised expression, followed by a assenting "of course." Right? So in the past, the difference between this sea change and others in Christian history is it didn't come with bloodshed and councils and people being ostracized and banished, which all other Christian councils dealing with problems. This came gradually and then all of a sudden as a rush. So by 1985, we have a Catholic scholar saying that it's become commonplace, theologically commonplace. We tried in a paper to list every thinker or theologian since Joseph's day to ascribe to God the full body characteristics of personhood, most especially passibility. It was impossible, so we listed a few. These are very distinguished names from every corner of the classic tradition. You'll see Barth, Bonhoeffer, Cobb, Kuhn, Moltmann, Surratt, Neuer, Pannenberg, right? So Sanders, Pinnock are from the open strain. So it's ubiquitous now, starting right about the late 1800s. Just as significant as the list of contemporary proponents of divine passibility, according to Getz, is the fact that even those theologians who have not embraced modern theopassism have failed to develop a creative restatement of the older dogma. He says that von Hegel and Thomas Winandy perhaps are significant exceptions. As I mentioned, this is Thomas Winandy's book. He does try and defend the classic position. We actually wrote a paper reviewing his work and didn't find it favorably, obviously, but there's not much there holding this old dogma up, and it's very significant, right? This is a huge strand, because once you get rid of immutability, right? If impassibility, if he can change emotions, that means he is changeable. So you've gotten rid of immutability, and it's almost a domino effect down the line, right? Because these systems are so tightly bound logically, and they're very logical systems. Once you pull that thread, it becomes hard to keep the entire bundle of attributes together. During this present century, the idea that God is immutable and impassible has slowly but surely given way to the idea that God is sensitive, emotional, and passionate. By now, the rejection of the ancient doctrine of divine impassibility has so much become a theological commonplace that many theologians do not even feel the need to argue for it. It's fascinating. Huge, huge change. Moltmann is so convinced of the rejection of divine impassibility that he writes, "The doctrine of the essential impassibility of the divine nature now seems finally to be disappearing from the Christian doctrine of God." What's our conclusion? Joseph Smith revealed this personal, passible God in 1830, right? He has Enoch having God weep, right, and asking how it can happen. He has the resurrected Christ suffering and feeling emotion with the people of the Americas. He revealed a personal and passible God that was drastically different than the then accepted God of Christianity. Now, more than a century later, this view of God has now been reaccepted by virtually all of Christianity. What does it mean for, let's move to creation ex nihilo. I had a few emails about this asking to go a little bit more in depth, so I added this to this session. Writing at the beginning of the 2nd century, Philo Judaeus, the Alexandrian Jewish philosopher, very influential in terms of translating Platonic thought into Christian ideas, and then influenced the rest of Christianity for centuries. Very, very influential. He expressly taught that God created out of already existing matter. He stated, quote, "This cosmos of ours was formed out of all that there was of water and air and fire, not even the smallest particle being left outside." This is early 2nd century. Elsewhere he stated, "When the substance of the universe was without shape and figure, God gave it these. When it had no definite character, God molded it into definiteness." Clement, Bishop of Rome, also at the beginning of the 2nd century. He's really important because he's at the center. He's the Bishop of Rome, so he's at the center of the Christian church as it was developing. He also assumed that God had created from an eternally existing substrate. So he said, quote, "God made manifest the eternal fabric of the world." Right? So there's the world with eternal fabric. He made that manifest in this creation. God created by, quote, "making manifest what had already existed in some form." Notice that the lack of argumentation or further elucidation indicates that Clement was not attempting to establish a philosophical position. Recall when we talked about divine embodiment, we saw that they were arguing for an immaterial God. So it was a new position in the 3rd or 4th century. We talked about that last session. In this case, it's the opposite point. They're not arguing for it. It's a stated view, right? He's stating a generally accepted position rather than arguing for something new. If he had presented an argument for this view, then we can assume that it was either a contested doctrine or a new view. However, because he accepts it as obvious, it appears to be a generally accepted belief in the early Christian church. Further, there are at least 4 late 2nd century Christian philosophers. So now we're moving forward, right, 100 years, early 2nd century, now we're late 2nd century, who believed that creation out of pre-existing matter was the established Christian doctrine. First, we have Justin Martyr. He writes about 165 AD. He taught that Plato had received his doctrine of creation from Moses' writings. No way to document that, but again, they were in this mode of marrying the two traditions, so this was his attempt to do so. And that you may learn that it was from our teachers, we mean the account given through the prophets, that Plato borrowed his statement that God, Plato doesn't use the term God, he's demiurge, but God, having altered the matter which was shapeless, made the world, right? That Plato borrowed it from Moses. Here the very word spoken through Moses, who as shown above was the first prophet, and of greater antiquity than the Greek writers, and through whom the spirit of prophecy, signifying how and from what materials God at first formed the world. Right? From what materials? In the beginning God created the heaven and earth, and the earth was invisible and unfurnished, and darkness upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved over the waters. Right? And so God said, let there be light, and so on. So that both Plato and they who agree with him, and we ourselves have learned, and you also can be convinced that by the word of God the whole world was made out of the substance spoken of before by Moses. Right? So he's trying again to marry the two traditions, and one of his arguments is, look, Plato got this idea of creation from pre-existing matter from Moses, right? Late 2nd century, 165 AD. He's arguing that he has learned in the Christian tradition that God created by his word all things by organizing matter. And this is the view older than Plato's. The verb that he uses by altering matter is strepsanta, meaning rotating or turning. It echoes Plato's view taught in the Timaeus that the demiurge created the cosmos by setting the world's soul in rotation, and by the same act matter is ordered. Right? So he's marrying those two.
So basically this is a conversation versus creation is made from matter versus creation is made from nothing?
Yes. Okay. Yes. Creation ex nihilo, we're going to get to it, but it's a huge point. It affects everything down the line, right? If human nature is created, if matter is created, it matters for everything, from the problem of evil all the way down.
What about the idea of spiritual creation, the first creation? If you create something spiritually, isn't that created from nothing?
No, I mean, Joseph didn't teach that, right? Joseph taught that human spirits have eternal existence. So,
I mean, like in, let's say, the Egyptian endowment, using that for example, that things are created spiritually, like everything in the 7 days.
Yeah.
And then things are created physically.
They still had no concept of creation out of nothing. So even spiritual things, so right, we talked about last week how the Greek word for God is a spirit, breath, that was actually matter for them in some sense. So they had a notion of quote unquote more refined matter, as we might call it, as we term it in our terminology. They had that notion absolutely. They had creation ex nihilo is a created, it's created out of nothing, about late 2nd century.
Okay.
So even those spiritual creations were from something pre-existing, some spiritual matter, not out of nothing.
Thanks.
Athenagoras, again, 170 AD, also taught that God created by crystallizing an already existing substrate. He stated that the logos or word came forth to be the idea and energizing power of all material things, which lay without attributes, as inactive earth, the grosser particles being mixed up with the pure. Again, most of these guys are coming from I don't want to confuse the issue, they are thoroughly Platonic, right? Notwithstanding their view of creation, they are fully Platonic at this point, and they're trying to marry these worlds, and they're going to figure out quickly that creation from matter actually doesn't fit well with the Platonic ideas. But at this point, it hasn't worked itself out yet. Third, he's actually writing after the creation of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo was created by Tatian and Theophilus, but he still hasn't gotten the memo yet. By this time, all parties discussing the issue are departing from Platonic assumptions about God and matter. Tertullian tells us that Hermogenes argued for the existence of eternal matter based on the Platonic assumption that matter is evil and therefore cannot be created by a good God. This is important. This is where they go with it. But we find evil things made by him, although not by choice or will, because if they were made by his choice or will, he would have made something inconsistent or unworthy of himself. What he does not make by his choice must be understood to be made by the fault of another thing, from matter without doubt. Right? So if matter is bad, right, he's arguing actually against creation out of nothing because God can't create something that's bad. So matter has to pre-exist God because it's bad. Otherwise, again, we're stuck with God actually creating something bad, which is matter itself. So he's actually arguing, again, from Platonic ideals, but for the old tradition. Clement of Alexandria, writing now, we're still 220 AD, so, right, also adopted the view that matter is eternal and that God creates by organizing a chaotic substratum. Indeed, he uses the phrase made out of nothing 3 times, but each time he uses the technical term, which shows that he is discussing creation from relative non-being rather than creation out of nothing. So here's a poem. O King, maker of all who heaven and earth's adornment, by the divine word alone didst make, according to a well-ordered plan, out of a confused heap who didst create, right? Created out of a confused heap. This ordered sphere, and from the shapeless mass of matter did the universe adorn. So we're pretty late here. So, again, we must note that the position adopted by these 4 that God created by organizing matter was inherently unstable within the context of their theology of God. Right? Each of them had adopted a thoroughly Middle Platonic view of God. So, it was unstable. The early Christians had been accused of being atheists because they did not accept the Greek views of God. Latter-day Saints have been accused of being atheists because we do not accept theistic traditions about God. Instead of responding by defending the Christian view of God who could reveal himself in the flesh, Athenagoras argued that Christians believed in the same God as the Greeks. Right? So rather than defending the old view, the biblical view, they said, no, we actually worship the same being as you. I have sufficiently shown that they are not atheists, Christians, who believe in one who is unbegotten, eternal, unseen. Now we get into the Greek terms, impassible, incomprehensible, and uncontained, right? Comprehended by mind and reason alone, invested with ineffable light and beauty, and spirit and power, by whom the universe is brought into being and set in order and held firm, right? The apologists of the late 2nd century adopted creation ex nihilo primarily because it was required by the Platonic view of God, which they had also adopted. They were quite correct to point out that God, conceived as the Platonists did, required a God who is completely independent of the world and stands over against it. Right? So they are being consistent. We have to understand that. We're going to go through a few people that recognize this as again non-Mormon theologians. Since the time of the apologists first began to offer a reasoned and philosophical presentation of Christianity to pagan intellectuals, Christian thinkers had claimed to worship the same God honored by the Greeks and Romans. In other words, the deity adored by other reasonable men and women. Think about that. If most of the people don't believe in God, in our society, but if that's what's reasonable, it's a strong pull, right? It's a strong pull for them. Indeed, Christians adopted precisely the same language to describe God as did pagan intellectuals. The Christian apologists, who we just talked about, right? He used ineffable, expressible, uncontained, incomprehensible. The view that God was an immaterial, timeless, impassible divine being who is known only through the mind became the keystone of Christian apologetics, for it served to establish a decisive link to the Greek spiritual and intellectual tradition, which they were seeking to do. So here's our 2 guys. Tatian and Theophilus are the first people to create the doctrine of creation out of nothing. Tatian lives 120 to 180. He was a pupil of Justin. We talked about Justin, who taught creation ex materia, creation from matter, but his views were quite different. He begins by defining a new view of God. Our God does not have an origin in time. He alone is without beginning, while he is the beginning of all. Right? Finally, this is the God outside of time, the God existing alone, the God that nothing exists prior to his being. Earlier thinkers had adopted a view of God as transcendent and utterly independent, while limiting his involvement with the world to creation by matter and the necessities inherent in matter. Tatian created a new view of God who is alone in his power and able to create matter out of nothing. He's the first person in history to expressly teach the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. The reason that matter had to be created, according to Tatian, is that otherwise it would be equal to God. Neither is matter without cause as is God, nor is it equal in power to God because it is without cause. It was generated and was not generated by anyone else, but it was expressed only by the demiurge of all. Even using the Greek, right, Timaeus term for God, right? So He's the first person to do it. Theophilus is the second person in history to adopt expressly the view of creation ex nihilo. He wrote shortly after Tatian around 180 AD. In the extensive investigation regarding the origin of this doctrine, James Hubler stated, creation ex nihilo marked a major redefinition of the material cosmos by the Christian apologists of the late 2nd century Tatian and Theophilus of Antioch. For Stoic Platonists and Peripatetic alike, matter imposed, this is the school of Aristotle, or based on his teachings. So for Stoic, Platonists, the school of Aristotle, matter imposed the natural necessity of corruption upon the body, right? Matter is bad. The moral limitations imposed by matter made a bodily resurrection seem offensive. Christian hopes for resurrection seemed misguided both intellectually and morally. The Christian apologists of the late 2nd century struck back by redefining matter as a creature of God, which he directed toward his purposes. The religious claims of the Christian apologists signaled a major philosophical change. Right? Ronald Simkin. Creation in the Bible is never ex nihilo, from nothing. This doctrine was not formulated until the Hellenistic age. In the biblical tradition and in the ancient Near East in general, God always works with some material that is either primordial or already there when God begins to create, though the ancient Israelites would not have made this distinction. God creates either through establishing order and fixing boundaries, usually by separating a primordial substance, or through the natural physical processes of birth and growth. In the Yahweh's creation myth, the earth itself is primordial. You'll notice in Genesis, the earth is formed, right? But without form, it's void, right? God never creates the earth, but the earth without God's creative activity is barren and lifeless, right? None of us would ever accept a early Jewish understanding of the world, right? They're not going to teach. We know much more about our physical universe. They're teaching us really about God's interaction with his people. And how does God interact with us, right? He separates us, right? He covenants with us. So even the creation myth of the Yahwehs is about that. It's about establishing that creation or that relationship with humans. They're not interested in creating out of nothing, and they're not even teaching us that we would never accept their ideas about creation. But that's not what they were doing, right? It wasn't until late 2nd century that we get these ideas. Creation ex nihilo appeared suddenly in the latter half of the 2nd century. I'm just going to keep pounding it here. Not only did creation ex nihilo lack precedent, it stood in firm opposition to all of the philosophical schools of the Greco-Roman world. As we have seen, the doctrine was not forced upon the Christian community by their revealed tradition, right? Either biblical texts or the early Jewish interpretation of them. He also goes through a ton of the New Testament, as you'll see. It was not a position to test in the New Testament or even sub-apostolic writings. It was a position taken by apologists of the late 2nd century, Tatian and Theophilus, and developed by various ecclesiastical writers thereafter, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen. Creation ex nihilo represents an innovation in the interpretive traditions of revelation. It cannot be explained by merely a continuation of tradition.
You're saying this was created ex nihilo?
Yeah, and in fact, if you're, I'm taking a lot of this from Blake Osler. If you Google Blake Osler, his title of his article is "The Doctrine of Creation of Ex Nihilo was created out of nothing." It was. Gerhard May reaches a similar conclusion in his extensive study. If one reviews only the orthodox line of development that led to the formation of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, there emerges a picture unambiguous in its main outline. For the primitive Christian thinkers, the origin of the world does not yet present a problem. Even in the early 2nd century, after the intensive concern of Gnosticism with cosmology had set in, the spokesmen for the Church of Christianity still stand by the traditional statements about the creation of the world and do not allow themselves to get involved in controversy over the new questions. At the same time, philosophically educated teachers like Justin interpreted the creation as world formation and established a relationship between the cosmogony of Moses and the myth of world creation in the Timaeus. We just read that quote. Then in the controversy, partly conducted in parallel and partly overlapping with both the Gnostic and the philosophical cosmologies, the world formation model is overcome and the doctrine of creation ex nihilo formulated as a counter-proposition, which as early as the beginning of the 3rd century is regarded as a fundamental tenet of Christian theology. So that's when it's a fundamental tenet by the 3rd century. Our conclusion It is the accepted view of virtually every scholar who has reviewed the evidence at length that the doctrine of creation ex nihilo is a philosophical innovation at the end of the 2nd century. Joseph Smith's revealed theology of creation ex materia restores the original Christian understanding of creation. Now, like I said, there's lots of problems. Besides just being interesting, there's lots of problems that come from adopting creation out of nothing. It spawns at least 2 of them. First, the problem of Christology. In the narrow sense of the word is to define the relation of the divine and the human in Christ. We're going to go through that first. Later we'll go through this ontological gulf between creator and created has made it difficult for creedalists to accept the early Christian doctrine that we, mere humans, can nevertheless partake of the divine nature, as 2 Peter 1:4 affirms, right? Theosis. So we'll go through that. First, let's talk about the problem of Christology. So, Christology, generally speaking, if you were to get like a book like this, Christology, A Global Introduction, in a broad sense, it just talks about who Christ is and what his meaning is to the world. So, you'll get things like Black Christology, postmodern Christology, Christology in Latin America, search for freedom, Christ as liberator, right? So, in a broad sense, Christology, that's what it means. But in a narrow sense, the Christological problem of the early centuries is this. If human nature is created out of nothing, right? And then Christ, as begotten Son, must have been a created being, and thus ontologically contingent in his being, right? He's not necessary like the Father. Right? He's a created being like all humans. Whereas the Father was uncreated or ontologically necessary. Thus the divide between creator and creature became so pronounced that it is logically impossible that they both be found in the same person, namely Christ. Right? If you accept creation out of nothing, then the human nature is created, and it's entirely different, right? It's ontologically contingent, whereas divine, God, is the only thing that's necessary. This becomes a huge, huge problem for Christianity. We're not going to go through it. If you're interested in the debate, pick up this nice work, Early Christian Doctrines. But this is some chapters, just to give you a sense, to show you how they struggled with this for centuries. Look at the chapters of his book. Just not the whole book, but parts dealing with this. The beginnings of Christology. One-sided solutions. This will be where some say Christ is just fully divine, and others say Christ is fully human, right? You're dealing with 2 different natures, and so some take, both of these sides. The spirit of Christology, the apologists and Irenaeus, the Western contribution, the school of Alexandria, the East after Origen, 4th century Christology, the Arians. This is a big debate, right? Arians and the Christology of Athanasius. Apollinarianism, the Orthodox reaction, the Antiochian Christology, Nestorianism, again, big problem here, Cyril of Alexandria. We're moving through the decades and the centuries, debating this, fighting over it. This is a big problem. From Ephesus towards unity, the case of Euclides, Weston, Leo, the Chalcedonian statement. This was supposed to settle this doctrine, and guess what they did? They said that they both exist in Christ, undivided and unseparated. They accepted it all in a huge paradox. So you'll see that Kelly says, in spite of all, however, Chalcedon failed to bring permanent peace. Right? It did. What's our conclusion? We're not going to go through it. Why? Because by denying creation ex nihilo, Joseph Smith's theology obliterates the central Christological dispute. You don't have to deal with it, right? If he doesn't create out of nothing, there isn't an ontological divide, and the whole problem disappears. Something that they battled over for centuries, and lives ruined and blood spilt over this kind of stuff. They used to take their theology much more serious than we take it now. Both good and bads to that, I suppose. All right. So, let's continue now with talking about the nature of God, and we have to bring in the idea that God is somehow has these 3 people involved, right? So the Trinity. Classical theism, at least in the Western strain since 325 AD, since the Nicene Creed, theologians have been rightly convinced that the ultimate effect of Nicaea has been to assert not merely the equality but also the essential unity of the three persons. And they have attempted, I think, incautiously to represent this as the original and express intention of the Nicene Fathers. In support of this view, it has been argued that the homoousios adopted at Nicaea to express the form of Trinitarian theology prevailing in the West. Let's break this down a little bit. Who's read the Nicene Creed recently? Good. Okay. So, it's one of these creeds, like Chalcedon, that's meant to solve something, right? If you're interested, we have a paper on this as well. It doesn't actually solve anything, but the upshot is this. The upshot is that after this, it's taken to mean the essential unity of the three persons, right? In Western thought, which is what most of us are familiar with, the Eastern Orthodox Church kept to the separation of the three persons much better, but we're not as exposed to that. So since 325 AD, the Trinity that we are familiar with, right, has been the essential unity of those persons, that one substance idea, right? God is simple. Joseph Smith in 1842, of course, famously in response to the Chicago newspaperman's inquiry, penned his 13 basic beliefs. They're as close to a creed as we get. And the first states are affirmation in the belief in the New Testament Godhead. God the Eternal Father, His Son Jesus Christ, and the Holy Ghost. His revelations repeatedly declare that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost are one God. Right? We have lots of that in his revelations. He also explicitly stated the Godhead consisted of three distinct personages and three gods. Right? So starting from the premise that three distinct personages make up the Godhead, Joseph understood their oneness or unity to consist of something other than metaphysical, right, or mind, shared mind idea, identity. Rather than as identity of being, Joseph saw their oneness as a unity of heart, mind, purpose, and mutually indwellingness. Right? So he emphasized their oneness with words like, this is the one doctrine, right, of the one God. This is the doctrine of the one God. Judgment of the one God. Baptism of the one God, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. There's the record of the one God. Seeing the Godhead as three distinct personages and three gods in no way diminishes their collective unity. Right? So Joseph asserted that the Father and Son possess, quote, the same mind, the same wisdom, glory, power, fullness, filling all in all. The Son being filled with the fullness of the mind, glory, and power. Or in other words, the spirit, glory, and power of the Father. Furthermore, he taught that, quote, everlasting covenant was made between the three personages, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, before the organization of this earth. In short, the persons of the Trinity are bound by everlasting covenant and by the same fullness, or what we would call the same set of divine attributes. Moreover, there's a synergetic bond between the Father and His only begotten, which is altogether peculiar to them. This bond was forged not only out of their oneness of minds, hearts, natures, and attributes, but also out of their interdependent missions, right? The Father needed the Son to accomplish His purposes, and the Son needed and looked to the Father for direction, power, and exaltation. So there's this synergetic mutual indwellingness between the two of them. Joseph's revelation declares, quote, and I bear record that He, Christ, received a fullness of the glory of the Father. He received all power both in heaven and on earth. The glory of the Father was with Him, for He dwelt in Him. Right? This mutual indwellingness idea. In addition to his testimony of direct experience, Joseph defends such a view biblically, right? He reads John 17:21. I want to read the text to you myself. I'm agreed with the Father, right? I'm one with the Father. And the Father is one with me, has agreed with me, and we are agreed as one. The Greek shows it should be agreed, so we do some exegetical work on the Bible, right? It's arguing from the Bible, but that they should be agreed, but not one, some sort of substance. So he explicitly rejected at least in the Western tradition, that's what we're going to talk about, traditional belief, the Godhead or Trinity was comprised of a single being. He understood the Trinity constituted by three distinct persons who together form one mutually indwelling divine community, perfectly united in mind, will, work, and love. In his revelations, the word God is used to designate the divine community, right, as well as to designate each individual divine person. So depending on the context, it'll be used ambiguously. We have been criticized nonstop for this view of the Trinity, right? Craig Blomberg said, and this is the book about how widely divided, how far apart are we from evangelicals. If we are prepared to accept as inspired something that is so divergent from all other religions, what would ever disqualify an idea from being a true revelation from God, he asks. Which is more likely, that everyone in the entire modern world was wrong, and Joseph Smith got it right, or that the tenets of monotheism shared by Jews, Christians, Muslims, and other theists are right, and Mormonism is wrong?
So how did the Nicenes come up with this? And what was the purpose that they came up with it after the death of Christ? Because it's a creed for man, and it's to control man.
Why did they came up with it? Because the central problem of Trinity, right, is 3 what and 1 what.
Yeah.
And they were trying to answer 3 what and 1 what, but they had to answer it in the context of again, Greek metaphysics, which said God had to be simple, right, and he had to be monism, right. He had to be one. He had to be one thing, and so if you're starting from that position, you're going to tend to say the 1 what is in the being, right? The 1 what is in the being, and the 3 whats is, this is where it gets weird, because they'll say persons, right? But when we talk, as we talked about to start with, when they're saying persons, they're not meaning what you would mean by person, as a center of will and action and love, right? They're meaning in some other way,
like spirit or something.
Who knows? So that's the problem.
Yeah,
who
knows?
Yes, and so if you would ask the layman, they would believe that they are monotheist, one God. And if you ask 3 what, they would say something like person. And if you say, what does that mean?
Well, what was the advantage of Constantine to introduce this?
Because if you could say a creed, and if you could get everyone to agree with it, I'll send you a paper if you're really interested, because we go through that in detail.
A creed is a change.
It got everyone to shut up.
Okay.
It got everyone to shut up, and it gave enough words to one group that said, oh, we're right.
Okay.
They agreed with us, and it gave enough words to the other group that said, oh, we're right.
So that's what I was missing. There was a discussion going on in the first century.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, for centuries, yeah. And it was a political compromise that again, what it really did is it gave enough words to each side to think they came out of it winner, and what Constantine got was peace. That's all he wanted, was political peace. So,
but it's fun watching how it's perpetuated as a lie today, and people blindly follow it because of this thing that was put out there, and then you walk through it as a ceremony.
Yeah. And we're going to get to it's finally changing a little bit. But again, I like the criticisms because they're fun. So, 1849, this guy it's hard to find this, but a British theologian asserted that Mormon doctrine was tritheistic, right? 3 gods. Right, because it denies the quote, the unity of the Godhead, right? Why Mormon baptism is invalid. The Catholic Church does not accept a Mormon baptism. Why? In 2001 it was reported that according to the directive, Mormon baptism did not involve the true invocation of the Trinity, because Latter-day Saints perceive the Godhead as consisting of 3 separate divine beings, rather than one God existing within 3 persons of one substance, right? So that's why if you want to go get baptized, you have to get rebaptized if you want to become a Catholic. It's not full immersion though, so it's all good. So what has happened recently is been called a revival. John Hicks, a non-Mormon scholar, describes the revival of what we call social Trinitarianism as, quote, one of the most significant developments in contemporary theology. We talked about passibility earlier, this huge structural shift that went from God is impassible to God is now passible. Now we're going to have another one in our understanding of the Trinity. Hicks calls it a revival because most scholars of Christian beginnings acknowledge that the social model predated the creedal one-substance view. In the 4th and 5th, this is Cornelius Plantinga, in the 4th and 5th centuries when the doctrine of the Trinity was being fully developed, there were particular limits on orthodoxy, and accordingly particular positions outside orthodoxy. As already suggested, virtually everybody who writes on the Trinity during this period identifies the monist heresy as some form of modalism. That's one being, okay? Monism is one being. That's what the modalism heresy is, right? So they understand it's a heresy. And then specifies that modalism is unacceptable because it allows belief in only one person. Unacceptable. And I want to add that the heresy on the orthodoxy's pluralist side is specifiable as well. Listen to this. And it is surely not the view that God includes 3 distinct persons. That's not the heresy on the pluralist side. That view lies at the heart of orthodoxy. agreed to by the Cappadocians and Augustinians alike. That's the Eastern and that's the Western. For the whole Augustinian age and for centuries afterward, modalism and Arianism. Arianism is what puts Jesus below God as a lower being. That's the heresy. Not the fact that he's separate and distinct, but that he's below. That's Arianism. They are the opposite Trinitarian heresies. And here again, social Trinitarianism affirms the standard Trinitarian tradition. Think about that. 1989. It seems to make more sense theologically to start from the biblical history and therefore to make the unity of the divine persons the problem, rather than to take the reverse method to start with the philosophical postulate of absolute unity in order then to find the problem in the biblical testimony. Right? If you start with the unity, you got to, what's all this with Jesus praying to God, he's praying to himself, right? That becomes the problem, right? We will describe the biblical beginnings of a doctrine of the Trinity in such a way that we shall be able to recognize the Trinitarian origin of the biblical history itself. He wants to flip it on his head, right? Let's not start with this philosophical postulate. Let's start with the Bible. And guess where he ends up? Leonardo Boff writes, "It is not surprising that Immanuel Kant should have written, 'The doctrine of the Trinity provides nothing, absolutely nothing of practical value. Even if one claims to understand it, still less when one is convinced that it far surpasses our understanding. It costs a student nothing to accept that we adore 3 or 10 persons in the divinity. One is the same as the other to him, since he has no concept of God in different persons,'" right? If it's what's 1 or 10 if you have no idea what you're talking about? That's what he's saying, right? It means nothing. Furthermore, this distinction offers absolutely no guidance for his conduct, right? So they're arguing actually from a practical perspective. What does this do for the Christian, right? How does it help your life? This observation shows, he goes on, that the Trinity for most people has become a problem in logic and ceased to be the mystery of our salvation. It has been reduced to a curiosity rather than being a reality that matters to us because it sheds light on our own existence and tells us the ultimate structure of the universe and of human life. This is the ultimate structure. Communion and participation, right? That's why the Trinity should matter to us. Communion and participation. Social analogy of the Trinity reasserts the religious teaching that the Godhead is composed of 3 substantially separate and distinct persons who are perfectly one in thought, word, intention, and action. Essentially, social Trinitarianism begins with the construct of a divine society and then bases the oneness of the persons in the harmony and union of activity in that society. Moltmann argues from a biblical standpoint, if we search for a concept of unity corresponding to the biblical testimony of the triune God, the God who unites others with himself, right? Not just Christ, but others. We must dispense both with the concept of the one substance, get rid of it, and the concept of the identical subject, get rid of it. He wants to throw them out, just like passibility is getting thrown out. All that remains is the unitedness, the at-oneness of the triune God. For the only concept of unitedness is the concept of a unity that can be communicated to others, right? That's what should matter to us and is open. I put this in here because he's going to argue from the Bible, from the same verse Joseph did. Listen to how he says it. The basic reason for this choice is to be found in John 10:30. I, the Father, and I are one. Note that Jesus is not saying the Father and I are numerically one, but uses a term meaning we are together. Just like Joseph said. Greek hen is used again in verse 38. The Father is in me and I am in the Father. The union of the Father and Son does not blot out the differences and individuality of each. Union rather supposes differentiation. Through love and through reciprocal communion, they are one single thing, the one God love. Right? Very interesting. Clark Pinnock articulates in this manner, this understanding of the Trinity as a transcendent society or community of 3 personal entities, Father, Son, and Spirit, are members of a divine community, unified by common divinity and singleness of purpose. The Trinity portrays God as a community of love and mutuality. Contemporary proponents of a social model of the divine unity represent every major Christian theological tradition, right? They include, we've talked about Plantinga, Layman, Richard Swinburne, David Brown, Moltmann, Boff, Pinnock, Morris, right? Illingsworth, William Lane Craig from the, we would call more far kind of right evangelical position, Stephen Davis. Every major Christian tradition. What's our conclusion? Joseph Smith revealed a Godhead that was drastically different than the then accepted Trinity of Western Christianity. This view of the Trinity is the accepted pre-creedal view and has now been accepted by thinkers representing every major Christian tradition. We won't have time to go into the divine feminine. So let's end there. Any questions? So we went through passibility being a core tenet of classical theism. Joseph obviously goes against it in 1830, and by the late 1800s, virtually every theologian is on board with divine passibility now. We go through creation ex nihilo. Everyone now agrees it was created at the end of the 2nd century because it was required by the presupposition of Platonic ideals. And finally, Trinity. Joseph reveals a Godhead in diametric opposition to the accepted view, at least in the West. And now it's, again, accepted as the creedal view and reaccepted by at least some proponents. Again, not fully, certainly not. If you talk to laymen, certainly not. But at least some proponents in every major tradition. Anyway, interesting stuff. We wrote a paper called "Are Christians Mormon?" A play on "Are Mormons Christians?" idea, where we would look through a number of different topics and talked about the structural shift, and in most cases towards Joseph's revealed God. So anyway, yeah.
So the more modern other Christian scholars and writers are writing this way, but the rank and file of the Catholic Church or of the other Christians aren't seeing this shift at all.
No, huge disconnect.
I bet they have a lot of debate and argument going on.
We should do some of these series in the local Catholic Church. But I've yet to. I mean, again, anecdotally, it's hard to find folks that are connected with the scholarship, amongst the laymen. But we have the same issue in our tradition. It's, again, theology doesn't matter to most people anymore. But it does matter if you're losing youth, right? With all major traditions are losing educated and losing youth. And if they're growing up with a God that is outside of time and immutable and he's beneficent, but he can't feel sick, right? If they've missed that structural change of a God who's loving, right? I would argue that it does, it matters greatly in their traditions as well. I'd be much, I don't care if people are baptized in the Mormon Church, but if they're believing in the same God that I am, that's compassionate and loving, and that wants to join in unity with them, that to me would matter. But again, disconnect. Yeah, if you talk to laymen, it's going to be, I don't know how much it'll flow through.
Yeah.
You can remind, when I do now, I will, instead of arguing my point, I'll say, I'll bring up somebody from their own tradition that agrees with me, perhaps, but it's a way to build bridges with folks as well, right? So, hey, you don't have to take my word for it. Read Clark Pinnock. The best discussion. I've read the best. Cornelius Plantinga has the best description of the Mormon understanding of the Godhead that I've ever read. No Mormon has done better in my view. Read Cornelius Plantinga on the Trinity. It's interesting, I think, because of those things. But I agree, there's a big disconnect.